growing population. If you had a fruit or vegetable today, there's a 43% chance that a woman produced it. Studies show that women account for nearly half of the world as smallholders, farmers, and produce 70% of African food. Yet less than 20% of land in the world is owned by women, and over 65% of land in Kenya is owned by customary law that discriminate against women, limiting their land and property right. This means that a woman farmer have to have access to the land through either their husband or son. Sometimes these male farmers members move to the cities, leaving women behind to tend the land. Land they have no right, use, or collateral. Even if you want to sell their output, they have to consult their men before they could do that. And sometimes you may think that the African woman's situation was probably worse than the Western countries. And you'll be surprised to learn that women's movement seeking for their rights started somewhere in the United States in 1848. But it was only in 1920, after they have fought for 72 years, that women in the United States were considered as the same as men and were given the right to vote. So it has not been easy for women, not in Africa or not in the Western world. Men, patriarchy has taken dominion, and they have subjugated women to such an extent that in some societies, women were not even considered as human. They were considered as the properties of men. Now, the text that we read this morning is about a woman, a princess, whose name was Tamar. Now, this was brought to my attention by one of the women theologians and scholar, Phyllis Tribble. And he wrote a book that he called The Test of Terror. And in The Test of Terror, Tribble writes about instances where women were treated unfairly, where women sometimes were killed and their bodies were dismembered and were given to gangs. And after I have gone through that book, I decided I need to start preaching about some of these things. I don't hear people or preachers or Bible scholars or teachers teaching about this, but we need to go back and find out where we started from before we pat our back as men and society. When anytime there's a Mother's Day, as if we have not done anything wrong. As we proceed, you're going to see that Tamar's cry, Tamar's weeping is going to be your weeping. The cry is going to be your cry if you're a minority. Here was a woman who was a princess. And as a princess, he was living in a palace. As a matter of fact, Tamar was not only a princess because she was the father of David. Her mother was a princess because he was the king's daughter. So he was a royalty from both sides, both from the mother's side and from the father's side. And yet this woman was living her life, and he thought that as a virgin, he was being protected. He was living in a palace. That's the most secure place anybody can find herself. If any woman needed a protection, there is no better place than to be in the palace. Unfortunately, one day, a stupid prince who was stricken by his lust. I'm going to read what we read again, some portion of it. He said, in the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. And now you have to understand that the word love that is used here, it has a different connotation and different meaning. As a matter of fact, when the Jewish or the they write the word love, it means so many things. And here, you're going to find out that the word lust that is used here is lust, not love. He said, Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. This guy was so devastated because he has lusted after her own sister to the point that he fell sick. I have seen a lot of people criticize St. Augustine. And the reason that many people criticize St. Augustine is because St. Augustine wrote a lot of things about sex that people thought it was a negative, has a negative connotation. But what St. Augustine, those people who are scholars of St. Augustine, if you read St. Augustine's writing a lot, if you read St. Augustine's book, The Confession, if you read St. Augustine's book, The City of God, which is a very big book, and you read closely what St. Augustine was saying is that as humans, we have controlled the mind, our intellect, the rational part of our faculty can control everything that we do. But St. Augustine came to the realization that one of the things that cannot, our mind, our faculty, our world cannot control is sex, lust. And that's why St. Augustine had that kind of negative, sometimes writing that people normally don't like to hear. Now, this guy was so obsessed with this woman, a princess. And the Bible said because he was a virgin, there was no way that Amnon could get access to her. There was no way. Because in the Hebrew, in the Jews, a sin like that can lead to your death. You will be stoned to death. And he knew it. And yet, because he could not control his lust, and sometimes the Bible said that the sin of fathers also transcend to the sons and the daughters. If you read the Bible from chapter 13, verse number 1, he says, in the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar. Now, in the course of time, what course of time is he talking about? You go to chapter 12 and you see what David did. When as a king, because of lust, he became a murderer and he became an adulterer. And God pronounced a judgment on him. Sometimes people with no knowledge of or with no proper theology say that God does not punish. When they see God punishment, they think that it's an evil. What we don't understand is that in theology, there is something called the simplicity of God. What that means is that God is simple. In other words, it's not like the word simple that we're talking about that we understand. What it means is that God is not a composite. So we don't have one part of God which is love, one part of God that is holy, one part of God that is just. We as humans tend to use one aspect of God to describe him, but you cannot decompose God's character and attribute. The same God who is God of love is also God of justice. And so he said he was going to punish David, and he was right in punishing David. Unfortunately, in the course of it, we see Tamar became a scapegoat. Now, if you read further, you realize that as Amnon was stricken with his obsession and lust to have Tamar, he got to a point where a wicked counselor, who was also a cousin of his name was Abner, and he gave him an advice. He says, now, I'm reading from my Bible, said, Abner became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. Now Amnon had an advisor named Jonadab, son of Shimeah, David's brother. Jonadab was a very shrewd, a very wicked, a very evil man. And hear what he says to Amnon. Why do you, the king's son, look so haggard morning after morning? Won't you tell me? He said, tell me, and I will find a way out for you. Tell me, and I will give you an advice. And so let's listen to what happened when this wicked man came in, and he said, what do you, the king's son? That means you're a king's son. Anything that you want, you can have it. Whatever you want, you can have it because you're the son of the king. And Amnon said to him, I am in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. Now he's not describing her as his sister. Amnon said to him, I am in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. Go to bed and pretend to be ill. This is the wicked guy's advice. When your father comes to see you, say to him, I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight so I may watch her, then and eat it from her hand. He said, let him come and prepare the food in my sight. So as he was preparing the food, he was lusting after her. And what happened? And so David visited his son who pretended to be sick. And when David went in, Amnon told David exactly what this wicked advisor had told him, that he wanted his sister Tamar to come so he could cook for him and he could eat from her hand. Why would that happen? David couldn't even discern. There were so many maidservants in the palace that could have served Amnon. David could have been a little bit wiser to understand that that was a trick. But we hear that when Amnon was sick, David went to him. He went to his house to visit him. But when he came to his request to the princess, listen to what the Bible said that he sent a word, just a word, to summon the princess to come and serve this wicked son of his. And when Tamar went there, an innocent woman, not knowing the wicked plans of his brothers, he went there and prepared the food. And when the food was ready, he did it in a hurry. He sent it to his brother who supposedly was sick. And when he gave the thing to him, he would not eat. His intention was not for the food. His intention was for this woman. Now, if you read the Bible, they talk about in this character, those of you who do literature, you will see that there are 4 characters that are mentioned here. You have David's name was mentioned, Jonadab's name was mentioned, Absalom's name was mentioned, and Amnon's name was mentioned. Only one person in the midst of 4 men. And her name was not mentioned for anything that connotes power. It was not mentioned for anything that connotes privilege. He was mentioned as an object of sex. And in this situation, when this woman had come, Amnon asked her to bring the food to his room, his bedroom. And because of his wickedness, what he did was to ask his men, his servant, to leave the room. And they closed the room. Innocently, this lady presented the food to Amnon, not knowing the wicked plans of Amnon. Then when the food was presented to him, he said, come and lay with me. And if you listen to what this lady was saying, you'll be surprised how wise this woman was. If you read with me in verse number, let's read from verse number 10. He said, then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food here into my bedroom so I may eat from your hand. His intention was not to eat from her hand. And Tamar took the bread she had prepared, brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, come to bed with me, my sister. How stupid could he be? How could you go to bed with your own sister just because you want to satisfy your sexual pleasure? And listen to wisdom. Sometimes some men think that they are wiser than women. Listen to the wise princess. Listen to what he says. If you read from verse 12, no, my brother, she said to him, don't force me. Do not violate me. Do not have this. Don't do this to me against my will. I'm a human being. I have a will. You cannot violate my will. But somebody said, I remember when I was a student in high school, I read a book, and the writer said something that is very, very pungent. He said, an aroused hormone doesn't have a conscience. So there was no way that Tamar, with all her wisdom, could have reasoned with this stupid prince. So he goes on. No, my brother, she said to him, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. He said, this is never done in Israel. If you don't know, let me let you know that such a thing is never done in Israel. Nobody would do that. It is against our laws. It's against the commandment of God. If you read the book of Leviticus or Deuteronomy 22, it's against our law. We don't do that. Let's continue to hear what she says. And what about you? He said, listen, don't do this wicked thing. What about me? What do you think about me as a human being, as a person? What do you think about me? Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And in their culture, if a woman is raped, he would never marry. He would never see a man. Look at this young, brilliant, exuberant princess who was waiting for a time for her father and all her entourage to give her in marriage. Look at her. Now he's in the mercy. He has been thrown at the mercy of his wicked brother by his stupid father who was a king. And he said, you know, when I was reading this, when I was doing the study, sometimes I was weeping, I was crying. I could cry and weep with Tamar. I could see her heart. I could feel her heart. Somebody who intended to do good to somebody who was ill was taken advantage of because of the stupidity of a father. But he refused to listen to her. He called his personal servant and said, get this woman. No, not we have, I have even jumped. He refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she raped her. She raped her. What a violence against women. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. Do you read that? And you see, sometimes when we are reading the Bible in a hurry, but if you take your time to read this portion of the scriptures, believe me, you will weep. If you read the scriptures closely, you will weep. Now he raped her, and the most wicked thing that he did was that the Bible says after he had done that, he hated her more than he loved her. He claimed he loved her. Now that he has satisfied his sexual pleasure, he hated her. Now Tamar, a princess whom every man in the land was looking for. As a matter of fact, if you read the Bible closely, Tamar and Absalom, they came from the same mother. The Bible said both of them were so beautiful. He described Absalom as the most handsome person that anybody could find. Yet, despite her beauty, after this guy has used her, he said he hated her more than he loved her. He didn't love her to begin with. He saw her as a sexual object. And after he had satisfied his sexual libido, he hated her. And listen to what she did to her. And that's what makes me cry and make me weep. He said, then Ammon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than her loving. Amnon said to her, get up and get out. Now put yourself. You may not be a woman, but you are a man. Can you imagine somebody doing this to your daughter? Just think about it. Can you imagine anybody doing this to your daughter? He raped her, and then after he has finished raping her, she became a non-entity to her. She became nothing to her. As a matter of fact, the Hebrew say, get up, get out. That's how it put it. He was just an object to her. Let's continue as we continue to read. He says, and what does he say? No, she said to him, sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me. You have destroyed me. But then in the Jewish law, anybody, if you rape a woman and you are not killed, you have every obligation to marry that woman till the end of your life. So Tamar was saying that I'm your sister, but you raped me. Don't ask me to leave. What do you want? What do you think is going to happen to me? Nobody is going to take me. Now that you have done this thing to me, take me then as a wife. He will not listen. And if you go on, he says, Amnon said, get up. Sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me. But he refused to listen to her. He called her his personal servant and said, get this woman out of my sight, and bolt the door after her. I think the Hebrew doesn't even use a woman. He called his servant and said, get this out of the door. She treated her like a dog, a princess, the most beautiful woman in the land, was abused. He was raped. He was deceived. He was raped. He was abused. And was thrown out like an animal because she was a woman. But she refused to listen. He called his personal servant and said, get this woman out of my sight, and bolt the door after her. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. She was wearing an ornate robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. She had a robe that she wore, that anybody that sees her will see her as a prince. And then they will see her also as a virgin. You know what she did? It was no use anymore to her. It was no use anymore to her because now he has been violated. Now she's no more a virgin. Now he cannot have anybody to marry. And what did she do? And weep with Tamar, as Tamar weeps. So his servant said she was wearing an ornate robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornament robe she was wearing. I weep when I was reading this. She put her hand on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. She put her hand on her head and began to wail. You know, some of you who have seen women wailing and weeping at home when somebody is dead. That is what Tamar was doing. Her life had been killed. He was dead. Her life had been taken away from her. And now, what happened? When David heard this, that's why it really, really annoys me. The Bible says David was angry. That is all that we hear from David. This son of his should have been stoned to death. But the Bible said David was angry. And some scholars, Hebrew scholars, translate the portion in Hebrew that David was angry because his son had done that. Because having done that, he was he was the crown prince. So he was thinking more about his son, not the daughter. But he was going to pay for that. And as you read, you're going to find that David's house was never the same. And so Absalom, who was his full brother, took her. And he talked to her. He said, "Has Amnon raped you?" Said, "Keep quiet. Just be quiet. Don't say anything. This is a family affair. Just be quiet." I mean, that's all that Absalom could also tell her, as far as the story is concerned. But as you read chapter 14 and others, you realize that Absalom decided that the punishment that was due Amnon, that David did not exercise, Absalom, as a brother of Tamar, decided that he was going to exercise that right to kill Amnon. And killing, he did. And the rest of the story will tell you about what happened in David's kingdom. He almost lost his kingdom. Absalom rebelled against him and temporarily even became a king, just because of the foolishness of Amnon, taking advantage of women. Today I'm talking about women, but it could be a man. It could be a minority. If you're a minority, you can cry with Tamar. If you are somebody who has been declared a nonentity in a society, you can cry with Tamar. We can weep with Tamar. Tamar cries will become your cry. His predicament will become your predicament. Who was a woman who was wounded, despised, rejected by men and women. He never married. He never saw a man the whole of her life. but there was a resuscitation that Absalom bore a daughter and named that daughter after Tamar. This morning, I don't know where you stand. This message may catch you, or you may be listening to me as a man. I'm not pronouncing judgment on you. I'm not saying that you do the same to your wife or your sister. What I'm saying is that because of patriarchy, society has done a lot of harm to women, just like slavery and other things have done to minorities and Black people. And today, as we celebrate Mother's Day, I want you to read the Bible with a keen eye and realize that there are certain things, there are times that people say, oh, I found this in the Bible. And so everything in the Bible, some teachers of the Bible feel that anything in the Bible is okay to do. No, there are things that we need to read and repent from. This morning, I want you to pray with your family. Hug your daughter. Hug your wife. Let them know, unlike Amnon, unlike David, you care dearly about them. They are human beings. As a matter of fact, the Bible says, you see, in Genesis chapter 3, he said, Adam named his wife Eve because he was the living. He was the mother. He is the mother of all the living. As a matter of fact, sometimes we think that women in the United States had more rights than women at home. When I was at college, I was reading a book by Dr. Buzia, a sociology book. And he says there were some times that even in Africa, in among the Akan tradition, women were the ones that were in charge until a time that because of certain things that I don't want to go through, that it became necessary to put their sons in charge. So African women, to some extent, when it comes to power and authority, and even at this time, before a king is installed, he has to be appointed by the Queen Mother. I believe we need to understand this and have a different look at the way we treat our women. Let's pray. Our Father and our God, we thank you and praise your name and glorify your name. You are the King of kings and the Lord of lords. You are the Alpha and Omega. It is not your intention that society treats each other the way we do. The Bible says you created them equal, the male and the female. There are those who said that the man has to subjugate the woman because the woman was created out of the rib of the man. That's a nonsensical logic. If the man came from the dust, would the dust subjugate the man? If that is the analogy. The woman was refined. She did not come from dust. He came from a refined human. And so if the rib and man's analogy and woman analogy holds, the man may be subservient to the ground. But that's not the case. We are all created the same. Lord and our God, open our eyes to see every human being as equal. Black, brown, woman, man, Gentiles, Jews, white, everybody. You created everyone in your image. May you give us an insight to know this truth. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.